The preacher stared at him, arms crossed, eyes cold. "This is God's house, son, not a stage." But Elvis just nodded, stepped to the pulpit and whispered a prayer. When he began to sing, the church didn't just fall silent. People swore they felt heaven open. What happened next became legend. July 4th, 1953. First Assembly Church, Union Avenue, Memphis. The air shimmered like heat off asphalt. Inside, the pews groaned under the weight of almost 200 people. Fans waved folded programs. A baby cried somewhere near the back, but even that sound faded when they saw him walk in. Elvis Aaron Presley. 19 years old. No fame, no rhinestones. Just a thrift store jacket and a borrowed guitar. He walked down the narrow aisle, eyes low, hands trembling. The wooden floorboards creaked with every hesitant step. He wasn't here to show off. He was here to prove something. Whispers followed him. "Isn't that the truck driver kid? He sings those bar songs. Why's he here?" But there were a few soft smiles too. Mostly from women who'd heard him hum in the church parking lot after youth service. At the altar stood Reverend John Harper, a tall man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority like thunder. He'd been preaching at Union Avenue for 20 years. He believed church music was sacred, untouched by the noise of the world outside. As Elvis reached the steps of the pulpit, the Reverend stepped forward. "You sure you want to do this, son?" he asked. Elvis nodded quietly. "Yes, sir. I just want to sing for the Lord." Harper frowned. "Then keep it holy." Elvis smiled, nervous but calm. "Yes, sir, I will." The organist, Miss Lillian Ford, watched from the corner. She was in her 50s, glasses perched on her nose, the kind of woman who could make an organ sound like thunder or tears. She had been skeptical too, until she'd heard him practice. There was something different in his voice, something that didn't belong to one kind of music. It belonged to every kind. Elvis set his guitar on the floor, took a deep breath, and whispered a line his mother had told him once. "Sing from the soul, not from fear." The congregation shifted in their seats. No spotlight, no microphone, just the hum of an old fan and the faint scent of candle wax. He strummed a soft chord, then another. The sound echoed against the walls. Reverend Harper folded his arms, unimpressed. And then the first note came. Low, gentle, almost like a prayer. It wasn't the kind of song anyone expected. It wasn't a hymn they'd sung from a book. It was Peace in the Valley, sung the way only a boy who'd lived through hunger and heartache could sing it. At first, a few people frowned, but then, as the melody rose, faces began to soften. One woman in the back clasped her hands and closed her eyes. Even the baby had gone quiet. Something was happening in that room, something words couldn't explain. Reverend Harper shifted, uneasy. He wanted to stop him, but he couldn't move. It wasn't defiance he heard, it was devotion, raw, trembling, and pure. A single tear rolled down Miss Lillian's cheek. Later, she would swear the air itself changed temperature. That moment, one shy boy, one old church, one song, would live on long after the sound faded. But right then, the world outside didn't exist. Only the voice, only the silence that followed, and the question hanging in every heart. Was this worship, or something the world wasn't ready for? The last note still floated through the air when Reverend Harper finally spoke. His voice was steady but cold. "This is not what we do here." The crowd froze. You could hear the old fan clatter to a stop. Elvis blinked, unsure if he'd heard him right. He looked at the Reverend, then at the people who had started to smile, now turning awkwardly quiet. "I said," Harper repeated, stepping closer, "we sing hymns in this house, not performance pieces." He made the word performance sound like sin. Elvis lowered his head. "I didn't mean no harm, sir," he said softly. "I was just singing to him." The Reverend's eyes softened, just a little, but the room was watching. His authority had to hold. "This isn't the place for experiments, boy." Then something unexpected happened. A voice from the second pew, Miss Lillian Ford, the organist. She stood, hands shaking slightly. "With respect, Pastor, that boy didn't perform. He prayed." We all heard it. Gasps. A murmur rippled across the congregation. Reverend Harper turned. For a moment, his face went pale, not with anger, but confusion. He wasn't used to being challenged inside his own church. Elvis tried to speak, but his throat caught. He could feel every heartbeat in the room. He thought of his mama again, Gladys, sitting in the same pew years ago, whispering after choir practice. "They may not understand you now, son, but God will." He swallowed hard, stepped forward, and faced the preacher again. "Sir," he said, voice trembling, "it's still a hymn, just in my way. I ain't trying to bring the world in here. I'm just bringing me." The silence that followed was thicker than any sermon. Harper's jaw tensed. He looked around the room. Faces he'd known for decades, faces that trusted him. He could see tears, real ones. And for the first time, the old preacher didn't know what to say. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over Union Avenue. Inside, every second stretched like eternity. Then Harper nodded slowly. "All right, son," he said. "Sing it again. Let's see if heaven agrees with you." The crowd exhaled, some in relief, others in disbelief. Elvis smiled faintly, not out of pride, but gratitude. He picked up his guitar again, hands steadier this time. The first strum rang like a heartbeat. He began the second verse, softer, slower, every word a confession. "There'll be peace in the valley for me someday." This time, people didn't just listen. They joined in. Not loudly, just whispers at first, then harmony. A man in the back stood. A child hummed along. Soon it wasn't one voice or one song. It was the sound of a church rediscovering its soul. The Reverend sat down. He didn't move. He just listened, eyes glistening in the dim light. Miss Lillian wiped her cheeks. "Lord," she whispered, "what are you doing to us?" When the final note faded, no one clapped. No one dared. The silence said everything. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was revelation. Would you have had the courage to sing again? When everyone was waiting for you to fail, the first chord rang like thunder trapped inside wood. Elvis's fingers shook, but his voice didn't. It started as a whisper, trembling, unsure, then grew into something that didn't sound human anymore. He sang Peace in the Valley as if the whole world was hanging on that single note. And maybe it was. The rafters above him began to hum. Some swore later the lights flickered. Others said the air shimmered like heat off glass. Miss Lillian, still seated at the organ, felt her hands rise on their own. Her fingers touched the keys, though she hadn't meant to play. A soft chord joined him, perfect, haunting, unplanned. She would tell people later, "I don't remember pressing a thing." The organ played itself. Elvis's eyes stayed closed. He didn't see the crowd standing up one by one. Didn't see the man in the back whispering Amen. Didn't see Reverend Harper's lips part slightly, as if he'd just seen something holy. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a current moving through the room, pulling hearts like a tide. The young man's voice cracked on the bridge, but even that imperfection made it real, human, divine. Every story has a moment where it becomes more than memory. This was that moment. Then came the final verse. "Well, the bear will be gentle, the wolf will be tame." His tone deepened, breaking, pleading. The audience wasn't an audience now. They were part of the song. Tears shimmered on old cheeks. A mother clutched her child. A sudden snap. A light bulb burst above the pulpit. A small spark fell, glowing as it died. Gasps filled the church, but Elvis didn't flinch. He finished the last line, voice fading into silence. And that's when it happened. For nearly 30 seconds, no one moved. Not a cough, not a whisper, only the faint buzz of that broken bulb. Then someone began to sob. A grown man, a war veteran named Tom Riley, sitting near the aisle. He whispered, "I ain't felt peace like that since the trenches." People turned toward him, then back to Elvis, the boy who'd just shaken a room without moving a muscle. Reverend Harper rose slowly, gripping the pulpit like it was the only thing holding him upright. His voice was barely audible. What was that? Elvis looked down, confused. I just sang, sir. But the Reverend's eyes said otherwise. No, this wasn't just a song. This was the kind of moment people spend lifetimes waiting to feel. Lillian reached for her scarf, dabbing her tears. That wasn't a song, she said softly. That was a prayer. Outside, the rain began. You could hear it tapping against the stained glass, like applause from heaven itself. Elvis stepped back from the pulpit. He didn't know what to do. Bow, smile, leave. So he just stood there, guitar hanging at his side, breathing hard. Then the preacher did something no one expected. He started clapping. 1, 2, 3 beats. Slow, deliberate. Then the entire congregation joined. It wasn't loud or showy. It was reverent, grateful, like they'd just witnessed a miracle, and the only thing left was to thank whoever sent it. When the noise finally died down, the Reverend spoke again. Son, he said, his voice trembling, I don't know if that was rock or gospel, but I know the Lord heard it. Elvis nodded, tears in his eyes. That's all I wanted, sir. He didn't know it yet, but that night was being recorded. A deacon's teenage son, Henry Miles, had snuck in a little tape recorder. One of those bulky silver ones with a red button. The hum of that machine captured everything. Every breath, every silence. That tape would later surface decades later, labeled in shaky handwriting, Union Avenue, 7453. And anyone who listened could hear it. The sound of a voice that shook the walls of a church, and maybe something bigger, because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't start on stages. They start on knees. Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have clapped first? The rain outside turned heavier, drumming against the roof like distant applause. Inside, the church smelled of wet wood and candle smoke. The crowd stood frozen between disbelief and wonder. Reverend Harper stayed quiet for a long moment, gripping the edge of the pulpit. His knuckles were white. The silence in that room carried more weight than any sermon he'd ever given. Finally, he stepped forward, eyes on Elvis. Son, he said, voice trembling just enough to betray him. I thought you came here to stir trouble. He paused. But you came here to remind us what faith sounds like. A shiver moved through the crowd. Then, applause. Soft at first, then louder, until it filled every corner of the sanctuary. Elvis lowered his head. He wasn't used to that kind of noise in a church. He wasn't sure if it was celebration or forgiveness. Maybe both. The preacher raised a hand, and the sound quieted. That voice, he said, wasn't rebellion. That was redemption. Miss Lillian Ford covered her mouth with both hands. Praise the Lord, she whispered through tears. And just like that, the divide between pulpit and pew vanished. People began stepping forward. A woman pressed her hand on Elvis's shoulder, whispering, Don't stop, child. Another slipped him a small folded paper. A verse from Isaiah, written in pencil, Sing unto the Lord a new song. He held it tight in his palm. Outside, thunder rolled again, but this time, it felt like rhythm. That night didn't just change a service. It rewrote an entire church's soul. A local journalist, Ed Bailey, had stopped by the church that evening while chasing a weather story. He'd heard the music from the street and stepped in just in time to catch the final verse. The next morning, his headline in the Memphis Press Scimitar read, The Boy Who Made a Church Forget the Devil. Underneath, a grainy black and white photo, Elvis, eyes closed, rain behind stained glass. That photo spread quietly through Memphis. No labels, no record deal, just whispers. Some said, he sings like he's been forgiven. Others said, he sings like he's forgiving us. For weeks, strangers showed up at Union Avenue Church asking to hear the boys sing again. But Elvis never came back to perform there. He told Miss Lillian he didn't want to turn God's house into a crowd. Instead, he started visiting small gospel tents on the edges of town, places where nobody cared if his voice sounded too blue or too wild. They just listened, One night, Lillian received a letter. Inside, a simple line. "Thank you for letting me sing. You believed before anyone else did." It wasn't signed. Just the initials. EP years later, when Lillian passed away, her family found that letter folded inside her Bible. It was creased from being read too many times. Back at Union Avenue, Reverend Harper had a plaque placed on the wall near the altar. It read, "On this spot, July 4th, 1953, a song reminded us that heaven listens to more than one kind of music." That plaque is still there today, faded, almost hidden behind the new lighting fixtures. Most visitors don't notice it, but those who do stop for a while, some cry, some smile, because legends don't always begin with fame. Sometimes they begin when a single voice breaks the rules, and the rules give way. That night, Harper wrote in his journal, "Faith isn't meant to sound perfect. It's meant to sound alive." And when he died in 1971, that quote was carved into his tombstone. The rain stopped just before midnight that night, back in 1953. Elvis walked out alone, guitar in hand, head bowed low. The streets glistened under the streetlights. Somewhere a dog barked, a truck passed by, and yet, for that boy from Tupelo, the world already felt changed. He looked back once at the church. The windows glowed with the last candlelight. He smiled and whispered, "Thank you." Would you have walked away or stayed to sing again? Decades later, tourists visiting Graceland sometimes wander into the small white chapel at the edge of the estate. Inside, beside the old piano and faded hymnals, hangs a black and white photograph. Union Avenue Church, July 4th, 1953. In it, a young man stands by the pulpit, eyes closed, light spilling through stained glass. Few realize the story behind that picture, or that it marked the first time the world ever heard that voice. Miss Lillian Ford lived long enough to see Elvis become a legend. She never sought the spotlight, but whenever reporters came asking about his first miracle, she'd smile and say the same thing. He didn't perform that night. He prayed. By the 1970s, Reverend Harper's son, Michael Harper, took over the church. Unlike his father, he grew up in a world shaped by music, a world where faith and rhythm could live in the same breath. He founded a small organization called the Elvis Gospel Foundation, dedicated to helping young singers in Memphis record their first gospel tracks for free. On its door, a hand-painted sign read, "Sing from the soul, not from fear." Those were Gladys Presley's words, passed through time like a secret blessing. In 2003, during a renovation of the church basement, workers discovered a dusty shoebox sealed with tape. Inside, a single reel labeled Union Ave 7453. The tape hissed when they played it, but beneath the static, a faint voice filled the speakers. Shaky at first, then rising, and then that same silence, the kind that makes you hold your breath. For a moment, everyone in the room stopped moving. It was as if the past had stepped right into the present. That recording was later authenticated by RCA archivists. The label called it the Lost Union Avenue Tape. Only 300 copies were pressed, not for sale, but for donation to churches across Tennessee. Even now, when you walk into the small Graceland chapel room, you can see the plaque mounted beside the photo. Here began a song that heaven never forgot. It's easy to forget that behind every legend, there was once just a scared kid in a second-hand jacket, trying to prove he belonged. Tour guides tell visitors, "That night changed everything." But most people keep walking, unaware of what it really meant, because the true miracle wasn't the voice, it was what happened to everyone who heard it. Tom Riley, the veteran who had cried during the service, later became a volunteer chaplain at a Memphis hospital. He used to play Peace in the Valley for dying patients. "Every time I heard that boy's song," he said, "it reminded me that peace is possible, even at the end." Stories like his spread quietly, passed through families and church basements. Some say that if you visit Union Avenue Church late at night, when the street is empty and the air is still, you can hear faint music. the echo of a voice that refused to fade. No one can prove it, but no one wants to disprove it either, because the moment that changed one small church became something much bigger, a ripple moving through time, through faith, through sound, and that ripple never stopped, even now. Every time Peace in the Valley plays on an old record or across a radio, people who don't even believe in miracles pause. They feel something. Maybe they're not sure what it is, nostalgia, hope, grace, but somewhere deep down, they know they're hearing a voice that once silenced doubt itself, a voice that made a preacher weep, a voice that turned disbelief into devotion, a voice that bridged heaven and earth. Would you have believed it if you'd been there? Or would you have called it coincidence? In the final years of his life, Elvis rarely spoke about fame. Reporters wanted stories of Vegas lights and gold records, but he always turned quiet when they asked about beginnings. Once, in a small backstage interview in 1977, he was asked, "What moment defined you most?" He smiled faintly and said, "The day a preacher let me sing in church, and God didn't mind." Those words became his last great confession. It wasn't about rebellion or music or fame. It was about grace, the kind you don't earn, but stumble into when the world doubts you most. People talk about Elvis as a king, but that night on Union Avenue proved he was something deeper, a believer in second chances. The preacher who once doubted him became the man who defended him. The crowd that almost walked out became witnesses to a new sound, a sacred middle ground between gospel and the blues. And that's the moral that outlived them all. Because sometimes the world doesn't recognize faith when it's dressed differently. Sometimes holiness comes with a guitar instead of a hymn book. Faith isn't about staying inside the lines. It's about daring to draw new ones and believing that heaven still listens. Elvis never tried to explain what happened that night. He didn't have to. Everyone who was there already carried the proof in their hearts. Miss Lillian used to say, "When he sang, you didn't hear Elvis, you heard truth." Years later, at Graceland, his staff placed a single white candle in that chapel each July 4th. They call it the Union Flame. No speeches, no ceremonies, just silence. And every year, that small flame burns through the night. Same date, same light, same echo of a boy's voice, whispering peace into a doubting world. Because that's what legends really are. Not noise, not fame, but faith, set to melody. If you stand close enough to that candle, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of an old guitar string, the breath before the note, the hush that followed. It's not about religion. It's about something bigger. Belief, hope, forgiveness. So maybe that preacher was right after all. Maybe it wasn't rebellion. Maybe it really was redemption. And maybe that's what the world's been trying to sing ever since. What about you? Would you have silenced that boy, or listened long enough to hear heaven in his voice? If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes music can heal. Because faith isn't about the stage. It's about the song that stays after the lights fade. And sometimes the loudest miracles happen in silence.